So our first talk is one that I will be presenting, and it's on something called Acadia, which I know that some people will have heard of the word before, and many will not. It's not an English word, not naturally. What the English language seems to do with words that it doesn't have within it is go over to another language, follow it down an alleyway, beat it up, and then bring the word back as a trophy. And this is the principle that we're taking with Acadia. What you may have heard of is something called despondency. You may have heard of sloth. You may have heard of carelessness. And you may have heard of listlessness. Possibly in that order. And I don't think that any of them do the word justice. Because if you're talking about sloth and carelessness, you're thinking of very different things. Like, I'm careless if I knock over this table, but no one's thinking that I'm slothful, I assume. Unless I literally fell asleep on the table. So we're going to be looking at what does this word mean, and then why it's such a huge problem. Why it's one of the 8, what we call patrimonial passions. If you've heard of the 7 deadly sins, the 8 patrimonial passions comes before that. So why is it part of the 8 patrimonial passions? What does it mean and where does it fit in? Now, the problem of being both MC and speaker is that I don't get someone else to introduce me. So I'll just have to let the PowerPoint do it. But looking at all of that, answering the question, what actually makes me think that I have the chops to talk about this topic, it's probably not many of the things that you see on the PowerPoint, although they are factual. It's a product of hearing confessions, hearing pastoral conversations, and trying to respond as best I can with the wisdom of the church throughout the centuries. And so it's not quite the first writings, but the first products of the Desert Fathers really got codified by a man called Evagrius of Pontus. You may also see Evagrius Ponticus, same guy. And there have been writers throughout the centuries, but the reason why he's the first is because he was literate, which you've got to remember, centuries ago, not a common thing. And so he was able to codify and write down, so that we could have it today, what a lot of the ascetics were dealing with. So there's Evagrius of Pontus, and there's many other writers that talk about this sin, this temptation, I should say, this passion. It's not a sin until we fall into it. And so that's where I'm leading. That's where I'm leading from and presenting from. So at the end of this session, these are my goals. These are my goals for what we're going to be talking about today. So you should know, what is Acadia? What is this word that I keep saying and not really defining very well just yet? How it manifests in our life, an example of Acadia in the Bible. Hopefully we'll be able to look at that. Why we are tempted by Acadia, what it can feel like to experience this temptation, what sins follow if we don't try to restrain ourselves, and what we can do to fight against Acadia. And really that last point is going to be the focus of our group discussions. So I think every talk at this Syezd Youth Conference is having a group activity, some way that we are able to interact with what has been spoken about. And that's what we're looking at today, how we can combat this temptation at work and school, work and study. I think very few people here are actually at school per se, but at university as well. School or university, doesn't matter, same kind of idea. With friends, with family, at church, and at work. So aside from the word Acadia, do we understand what we're aiming for today? This means yes. I haven't told you what means no, but that's all right. Looks like we all understand it, so that's very good. Let's go to the... I decided to get a bit fancy with my PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going here, look at that. So let's look at the 8 patrimonial passions. Some of you will have heard me speak on this a couple of years ago, back when Syezd was all together in one place, up at Brisbane, I think it was. And so the 8 patrimonial passions is these. I first saw it on the internet as the 8 deadly dominoes, and I thought, well, that's catchy. It's more like the 4 dominoes, and that have 2 halves, but leave that to the side. You've got gluttony and unchastity, and they're paired. So it's not just because we're talking about dominoes, this is just a way of describing them. Gluttony, then unchastity, they're paired, and then they lead to greed and anger. And then we'll go to the second row. Acadia comes there. And then despair, vanity, and pride. Now, if you're more familiar with the 7 deadly sins, you're looking at vainglory going, I don't remember that, but it's kind of basically pride, isn't it? So perhaps a better translation is like vanity and then what we sometimes call prelest. Remember what I was saying about English going down dark alleys and finding words and stealing them? Well, we're just pronouncing it in English because it's our word now. And that's a useful enough way to be thinking about it. If you want to be going more into vanity and prelest, then I encourage you to do homework. I encourage you to be speaking to your confessor about what is this, but if I go into it, then I'm not going to finish my talk. So we're looking at Acadia, which comes after anger and before despair. Let's go through each of these in more detail. Here comes the first 2, gluttony. We think of gluttony as being food-based. Change that to thinking of it as consumption-based. We want to consume a lot of something. So does anyone remember when Pizza Hut was all you can eat, or am I showing my age? I might be showing my age. Imagine like 20 pizza boxes and there's a whole order of Italian food because they're the best foods that I can remember. Gluttony is desiring all of that pizza. Make sense? All right. Unchastity, the usual word that we use here is lust, but it's bigger than just sexuality. Yes, that's where we often see it. But it's bigger than that. It's to desire something a lot, to desire so much that it kind of possesses you. So in this little example, it's that you not only consume the 20 boxes of pizza somehow, but that you're almost possessed to consume them all. Good so far? All right. I'm going to come back to a sequence here where these lead to each other, but not just yet. Greed is the next one. Greed is where you don't just want the pizza, but you want the pasta, the lasagna, and the drinks, and the ice cream, and the everything. Yep. And then anger. Anger doesn't really work with my food analogy. Anger the way that you might see anger in this analogy is if someone says, actually, no, Timmy, you have to share. And then you flip the table. And this leads us to Acadia. Acadia is a bit of a transition point. So those first 4 are very much based on things. With Acadia, I stopped being able to use things in the example, and now it's about how I'm reacting. Not just outwardly reacting, but how that kind of changes me as a person. So Acadia is about insufficient care or insufficient reverence or taking things for granted. Often it happens as too much anger. And that's how that fits into that sequence. You have Acadia as a destroyer of focus. After that, despair. This is more related to depression than, say, Acadia is. But despair is the idea that God has forsaken us, that God wants us gone, that kind of idea. And then the next slide, I think, will round off with vanity and pride. Vanity to be thinking about ourselves, that we're the important one. Prelest to be thinking, aren't I good because I'm so modest? It's a real corrupter of virtue. So you can be, the world can think that you're amazing, and you can, on paper, be amazing. And if you go, yeah, I'm all that, then well, that's, if it's not prelest, it's real close. So there's our 8 patrimonial passions. And there's a sequence to them. I linked some of them together because they're so often seen next to each other. And you would have heard that already. So that's our big 8. Most of the things that we struggle with are somewhere in these 8 passions, these 8 temptations. Now, I could have talked about any one of those 8. Not because I'm all that, it's because I can, when you're assigned to do a talk, you've got a bit of time to do research. And any of these 8 would have been very good to speak about. However, why Acadia? Because I think that it's the biggest problem that is unspoken, that we don't really, that's not obvious. Like, people get angry, it's obvious. And there's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of resentment. There's a lot of ways that anger can come out, and we see all of them at one time or another. But it's obvious. Unchastity, obvious problem. Greed, obvious problem. Acadia, it's a little hidden. So that's why I wanted to talk about it today. It's hidden, and yet I think we all know that it's somehow pervasive as well. Even without quite knowing what it is, there's just something that's wrong, and let's see if this can put a name to it. So, what is it? There's a lot of different terms that we use to try to translate Acadia into English. And each of them have their own benefits and problems. I think probably the most misunderstood one is sloth. Because people say, I'm suffering from sloth. And what they mean is things like, I slept through my alarm clock, or I hit snooze 70 times because I just really didn't want to get up today. And I was actually tired. Sloth and laziness is its own issue. It may stem from Acadia, that's a different thing. But it's not the definition for Acadia. Listlessness. I actually like this particular word, but can I get a show of hands who could give me a definition? And that's why we don't use it. Despondency. I remember teen retreat a few years back, I briefly talked about these dominoes, and someone asked about despondency, and does that mean that depression is a sin? Can you think of anything worse for someone with depression than to hear that their clinical diagnosis is who they are is a sin? This is not the kind of thing that you want to have together, and the worst part is that it's not. We use the word despondency. It has those associations, but it's a thoroughly different thing. Sometimes brain chemicals are to blame. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that, but it's not Acadia. Carelessness. This is good if it's well understood. But carelessness as clumsiness is not what we're talking about. Carelessness about things that we should be full of care about is what we're talking about here. wasn't a good sound. Carelessness, like I knocked over a coffee cup and there it is. All right, that's careless. But I don't think many of us would really bring that to the confessional. But to what we're talking about would be that you spilt water in your icon corner because you just put your glass there and then you bumped it when you were spinning around or something. So there was insufficient care about what should be taken care of. There is a numbness factor to Acadia, where it's, I don't care anymore. That numbness of, I don't want to be obliged, I don't want to be doing things. That is absolutely a part of Acadia. Again, laziness has the same problem as sloth, and calling it sloth. Laziness is its own problem, but it's not the same thing. Dejection doesn't quite cut it. Apathy, we talked about. Spiritual discontent is very wordy, but it does carry the meaning fairly well, I think. Anxiety of the heart. I thought the last one was wordy. Again, a very good description. So sometimes it will be a discontent, and sometimes it will be an anxiety where you're going from place to place and nothing quite seems to work, but you're trying to fill a hole. That's an anxiety of the heart. Tedium, where everything is just so boring, nothing's capturing you. Ennui, which actually is a good translation, but it's a French word, so if we're going to steal a word, then we may as well steal it from the source. Melancholy has the same problems as despondency, and angst likewise. Each of these, in various literature, are used to translate this word Acadia. And on some level, each of them are right, but not fully right, or they're not fully a good translation. And so that's why it is that I'm using the word Acadia, and I use it when speaking to people, and why I think it's worth defining. So, let me just pause. Can I get a show of fingers? That is, hold your hand up like so. How confident are you with the definition of Acadia? So 5, very confident, I know what you're talking about. 1, can you help me out? So how confident are we knowing what Acadia is? Seeing a lot of pretty confidence, a couple of not very confidence. If I was to give like a 1-sentence definition rather than saying all the words that it's not, would that help? All right, it's tricky, but I'll give it a go. Everyone here is in Brisbane. You've lived here during summer, like right now. And you know how there's summer and then there's those 2 weeks in January that are just awful? And if you didn't have air conditioning, you'd probably move to Antarctica. And let's say your air conditioning doesn't work. And so it's like 1,000 degrees. It's like 2 p.m. 1 billion% humidity, because it's Brisbane. And you don't even have shade. You're just out in this concrete area, like King George Square or something. Sun's not only beating down on you, it's reflecting up from the pavement, because that's what we do in our infinite wisdom of design. And you would just want to melt. Everything sucks. The only thing worthwhile now is going to shade or air conditioning. We'll even go into City Hall if that's what it takes to be cooler and to be able to think again. Everyone experienced something along those lines? That's kind of how it feels to have Acadia. Everything sucks, I don't care, I just can't care anymore. I have an exhaustion of care, and I don't want to listen to your problems. I don't even want to listen to my problems. Nothing really matters. I just want to lie down in an air-conditioned room where everything's okay. Does that help? Looking for nods? I hope so. All right, awesome. Let's go to the next slide and hope that I didn't cross anything. The one good thing from this slide, I clearly didn't plan this very well, did I? Sorry. The one thing that I want to draw out from this slide that I haven't drawn out previously is that you can find this in Scripture. It's called the Demon of Noonday. And when we look at that particular time of day, we're looking at like midday to 3 o'clock. And if you're remembering, Evagrius of Ponticus and other desert fathers, well, what's a desert? It's hot. So what happens for the Demon of Noonday? Everything's hot. And if you're going to feel dejected, like everything doesn't matter at any time in the day, that's it. 12 till 3. You got no cloud cover, not a drop around. You might have your cave. Hopefully you have your cave. That's about it. And it'll be as insulated as a cave is. And that's it. So the Demon of Noonday is spoken about in Psalm 90. We actually hear that every week in our services. It mentions the Demon of Noonday. That is attributed to Acadia, to this particular temptation. And it tends to attack hermits a lot. It is one of the difficulties of being on one's own. So in this case, there is similarity between like living alone or living a very independent life and being a hermit, because you do have that solitariness is in common. And so the Demon of Noonday, that is Acadia, really can create problems for people. As I said before, it's the end of the base passions and the beginning of the complex passions, where you're really looking within rather than any external stimuli, or very much external stimuli. Next one. The root cause, and we may or may not lack this, the root cause is a lack of trust in God. Now, it's okay to admit this, that this is evidence that we're not 100% yet. Now, maybe we're at 80%, maybe we're at 90 or 60 or whatever, but we don't have that full and complete trust. If we did, we would have trust, we would have hope. And that's something that Acadia takes away, that hope especially, trust and hope. And so it's feedback that we're not at 100% yet, but it is something that we ought to address. We expect God to be acting now. We'll ask a moleben, we'll ask prayers that something happen. We'll ask for a job to appear. And sometimes the response is very quick, and sometimes the response is not as quick as we want. And we go, well, God hasn't listened. God hasn't acted when I told him to. Well, we've kind of got to trust that he's going to come through because he loves us. And as it says in the gospel, what father is there who the child asks for some food will give the child poison? We have to assume that our loving Father is being loving, that we ask and that we wait for things to happen in his time, not in ours. It's hard. Sometimes we need to keep asking. As was pointed out in the Gospels, it says knock and it shall be opened to you. It doesn't say knock once and you're good. We don't even do this for front doors. If we knock and we wait for a few minutes, what do? Or we call them, or we message them, or any one of a number of things. We try other ways. We try the same thing and get their attention. And when we look to the original, it's not just knock in the singular, it's be knocking and the door will be open to you. Knock continuously and the door will be open to you. Now here's where we come into the sequence of it. There's this whole sequence that arises from gluttony to unchastity to greed to anger and then to Acadia. It can go further as well. With gluttony, we are required to consume things. Actually, being human, we're required to consume things. We need food, we need drink, coffee. And even the fathers will talk about how gluttony is at once the most elementary and yet also the hardest, because the temptation is always there. The temptation is there right up until the grave. There will always be a point where we are required to consume, and thus we need to manage this passion continuously. And then we begin to desire. We begin to desire things with every fiber of our being. We desire something more and more. That's the next step. That's the unchastity step. And then we desire more and more things. We have expectations on things. This is greed. And then these expectations aren't met because it turns out that we don't have infinite resources and infinite everything. And what happens when our expectations aren't met? For many, that's where anger comes in. Anger is our response to unmet expectations. We think that the family should be ready to go now, and yet they're not. We have an expectation. We're not talking about whether it's reasonable or not, but we have the expectation. It's not met. The temptation is anger. And it can progress just like that. And after anger, when we have so thoroughly misplaced our zeal, when we've done that, then we've exhausted ourselves and we go, fine, I don't care anymore. Be ready on your own time. And we progress to Acadia. This untreated can then progress further. So we have Acadia as a consequence of anger. It's a place of nihilism, a destroyer of our contentment, and a cause for despair. Despair that, so you go from a spiritual numbness, nothing's worth caring about, to neither am I. Why would God care about me? Well, this should be fun. How does it work? So we have that sequence. Apparently I forgot that this slide existed, so I've really already gone through this. Great desires produce expectations. Expectations aren't met. First the rage response, then the I don't care response, and then despair is to be dragged down by this. Some red flags for Acadia. This doesn't mean that necessarily the passion is there, but you may want to address that blinking light. The check engine light is on. What do? Well, I mean, you could not respond. That is one option. Those who drive, what do you do if the check engine light is on? Check your engine. Or you can do what Penny did in The Big Bang Theory. And go, yeah, the check engine light's on. It's been on for a long time. That means you need to check it more. And good, I'm sounding like Sheldon. So if we can't do our prayer, then one of the reasons for this might be Acadia. Not giving care to what should be cared about. This is Acadia. It could be for other reasons, possibly. but this should be considered. We can do anything but prayer, including good works. So we'll put off prayer. If we're praying, then we're, by doing that, fighting Acadia. Prayer implies that there is hope, that there is something beyond us, that we are being obedient at the very least. We're fulfilling our baptismal vows. Another red flag, we're working by our strength. Anyone heard of burnout? Couple of nods. Can I just get little hands up if you've heard of burnout? Geez, like everyone? It's a real thing. It happens all too often in all different walks of life. Working by our own strength, especially if we're trying to do spiritual things, like I can do prayer, I can do the 40 minutes of prayer a day, and I'm awesome. Well, that last bit is a little too far, isn't it? That's already pre-less. But even I can do it, and I'm going to offer. All right, cool. That's a sure way to burn out, like within a couple of weeks, probably. And we see it a lot of times. Doing something by our own strength, doing something because I can do it. We turn God helps those who helps themselves, which is not a bad idea, but it's co-working that we should be aiming for. So work and ask help. Not work so that I don't have to ask help. Doing that, you're going to have a bad time. We think we're beyond God's forgiveness. This can be a sign for Acadia as well, where we postpone our obedience. Now, I'll do prayer later. I've just had dinner. I'll do prayer later. I'm just going to watch this show. I'll do prayer later. Oh, it's almost bedtime. I'm too tired. I'll do prayer later. Obedience is postponed. So this is a passion that utilizes information and half-truths in order to spoil the mind, where we have a state of ungratefulness, an embrace of negative thoughts. Because we've worked ourselves so much, in whatever way, whether it's anger or just we've worked ourselves to the bone because we haven't asked for any help. And so we have this embrace of negative thoughts. I can't do this. This rule is too hard. It leads to a number of things that you're able to read at the bottom of the screen while I take a drink. Leads to other things as well. That wanderlust is a discontent. It's a discontent with where I am now. The grass is greener, I'm going to go over there. Maybe it's better if I stand on that side of the room and then this side of the room. But usually it'll be in our work life, in our study. If only I had done a different degree at university. If only I had done a trade instead of a degree. If only I had lived out in the country instead of the city. If only I had lived in the city instead of the country. Just where anywhere else is better. We have disobedience that it leads to, where instead of being neglectful of the obedience, like prayer, I'll do it later, it's being willfully disobedient. Look, I can't do that, no. And forgetting the judgment. Because if you're remembering the judgment, if you're remembering all the things that were vouchsafed, and we'll talk about that a little later, if you're remembering these things, then you're not thinking Acadia. You're not thinking nothing matters. Because this life absolutely matters. Including when we don't think it does. This life absolutely matters. It's something that we need to guard against. This translation uses listlessness, but let's just read it as Acadia. Acadia alone seizes control of the soul's powers and arouses almost all the passions together. from St. Maximus the Confessor, who was very well known for fighting a particular heresy, but he was first and foremost a monk and speaks out of that experience. So now we know what the word is. We know something about how it's caused. How do we fight against that? There's about 6 different ways that we'll look at. The first, prayer. This forces us to trust God. And this trust, as we said before, this trust leads to hope. We stick to prayer even when we don't feel like it. I think it was our reader Ross yesterday who made reference to a line in the Gospel where the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent enter it by force. Sometimes you need to push through what you would rather be doing, so that you can get to what you need to do, what you ought to do. That prayer is as essential to us as our food, as our drink, as our breath. If we're in the case where we're underwater, we fight to be able to breathe. And likewise, sometimes we need to fight to be able to pray, even if this is brief. We're surrounded by a cloud of Acadia, of numbness, of despondency. Then our prayer may be much, much briefer. This is the context in which things like the Jesus prayer arose in. There's this whole genre of prayers called arrow prayers. Because when you're surrounded by a cloud, what gets through? Sharp things are able to get through. As in, Lord, have mercy. As in, grant this, O Lord. As in, Lord, help me. These kind of things are very, very helpful, and it's why the Jesus prayer has become such an enshrined part of our spirituality, because it works. Because it works for different peoples in different places and different times. It nonetheless works. Another remedy, psalmody. So praying the Psalms. I know that some will be praying Kathismas. So in Vespers last night, for example, you would have heard one of the Kathismas. I'm still not sure how to pluralize some words, but that's okay. You would have heard a Kathisma. There we go. And psalmody is especially important, partly because it is prayer in and of itself, but partly because a number of the Psalms were dealing with exactly this. If you know the story of the prophet and king David, he was dealing with Acadia a lot. Especially Psalms 101 and 17. I'm guessing that's based on the Septuagint numbering that you'll find in your Orthodox study Bible, just based on where I got this information from. So in your Orthodox study Bible, 101 and 17. Another remedy is to know your faith. Now, I'm not talking about going to seminary, although that's a very good thing. But what I'm talking about is knowing about salvation, about the story of salvation. And by story, I don't mean it's made up, because that's not the case. These are historical events. But about how it is that we are saved. That God loved us so much that he couldn't bear for us to be without him. So he went through all that he did. He went through the process of being incarnated, of the process of birth, the process of growing up, the process of being rejected by his people in every sense, and of giving himself up so completely and fully for each and every one of us throughout time and place, all the nations, all the people groups. And he did this so that we could be with him. Knowing the story of salvation helps us to see where we fit in, where we respond to to all that he has done for us. And this includes the thoughts of blessings to come, that we will be with him, includes knowing about the blessings that come from being there, the communion with God perpetually, the communion with other people perpetually, and that total oneness, and yet still being distinct persons, of course. That all the positives that we are going towards. We avoid what's called idle chatter, useless speech. So there's a lot of speaking that is positive, that is strength-giving. It's the idle talk that drains, that takes us down, where we leave a part of ourselves with different people. As you see, strength comes through words of comfort, being the shoulder for someone else to cry on, through anything beneficial and edifying that we are able to share. We therefore think about what we say in terms of what to say, when to say it, to whom to say it, in whose presence to say it, and have some thought about what the consequences could be. That's not all going to happen overnight, by the way. We may want it to, but it'll come because we've worked on it, because we've labored towards this. We fight Acadia through studying Scripture. Now, sometimes this will be through an immersion. We hear the narrative and we ask about problems that are there. Problems in our head with what's there. Maybe there's something we don't understand. Well, let's seek understanding. And other times we'll be sitting with our Orthodox study Bible and looking at the footnotes, looking for those explanations. Sometimes there's very straightforward explanations. Sometimes there's things that we had not even conceived or thought about, especially in the epistles. And my reference for that is from the epistles of Peter, saying that Paul's sometimes hard to understand. So if he found him hard to understand, it's all right for us too. Attention to our daily work. So this is doing what we do with our full attention. There is a way, and I'm just hearing the urn, so that's going to be my inspiration. There is a way that we can make coffee, and it's done. And no care was taken in the making of this coffee. And there's a way to be attentive to every step of the process, and to see this as your means of serving people. Everything about that encounter is different. So be attentively working. To stand, to pray, and sit to work was a guidance given to one of the Desert Fathers. Of course, it's in the context of monasticism, but the principle stands. To alternate between the manual labor, weaving or something that can be done sitting down, and then to stand to pray. And alternating that way is fighting against Acadia. To have patience in temptations, and to remember our own shortfalls, especially if we're leaping from unmet expectations to I don't care. Well, if we're remembering our shortfalls, then we short-circuit that. If we're remembering how we have not met other people's expectations when we should have. Sometimes expectations just need to be changed. But sometimes they're completely reasonable expectations. We were expected to be on time for our family lunch. And we were sloppy, so we were 15 minutes late. Well, sometimes we have wronged others. And to remember that is very important. Saint Silouan had a dictum that worked very, very well for him, which was it was translated as "keep thy mind in hell and despair not." And I always loved Saint Sophroni's translation of that. He was living in Essex, which I'm sure you all know is in England. And it was bring yourself to the brink of despair, and when you can't handle it anymore, have a cup of tea. And I thought, how incredibly English. Trying to say the same thing. To remember where we have wronged others. Not so that we dwell on this and become despondent through what we have lacked, but to remember that we're not all that. That we go to confession too. Each one of us. That each one of us wrongs others. That each one of us has wronged others, whether they know about it or not. That each one of us has done so, and that and thus we keep the perspective on forgiveness, on moving past these unmet expectations, and on doing our best to show love for others, to sacrifice in order to show love for others as best they understand. So, our conclusion. Acadia is hard. Like, the fact that it's the fifth of the temptations tells you that it's common, it's frequently experienced, and that it's challenging to defeat. One of the advices that's given is sometimes if you're wanting to work on a passion, try working on the one beforehand. At least then you can knock out whatever's leading to that passion. So in this case, we're talking about what do we do about reducing our anger? Or maybe we go further back in the sequence. But we bring this to confession. By bringing it to confession, we're already saying, I know that this is wrong and that I should be doing differently. Sometimes we'll have an understanding about what we should be doing different, but bringing it to confession is, even if we don't know what we should be doing differently, it is already saying, this is wrong and I should be doing otherwise. In our stages of repentance, when we're bringing, as part of that confession process, we do the thing, whatever the thing is. We do the thing, we realize that we do the thing. We may or may not have a feeling of sorrow. Our feelings aren't actually what determines if something is a sin or not. We still bring this to confession. Then we ask for forgiveness. Now this definitely means confession. This may mean of the person. And lastly, we resolve not to do the thing again. And then we go back up to the top usually. And we do the thing. And we follow the stages. Confession is something that is so vital because it realigns our life. It realigns our life towards Christ. Whether that's in the complete opposite direction or whether that's only half a degree off, doesn't matter. Confession is in part about realigning our life. We ask forgiveness of God and of the congregation. The priest is there as a stand-in for the congregation firstly, and to give the absolution of God. So the priest isn't just serving one role. He's wearing two hats, if you like. So you're asking forgiveness of God and the church for bringing sin into it. And you're receiving advice for the journey. You're receiving forgiveness of the congregation on his behalf, through the congregation's leader. And you're receiving absolution from God. This is why confession is so important and why it needs to be a regular part of our spiritual life. This is where I figure out, how did we go? And I already know we missed one thing up there, but that's all right, we'll get to it. So, what is Acadia? Who can give me a one-sentence definition for what is Acadia? Yes? Good. Not caring about things that you should be caring about. Very, very succinct definition for quite a complicated passion. Secondly, what are some ways that it manifests in our life? There's a whole bunch of possible right answers. Maybe I can take two. Yes? Yes? Yes. Anger and frustration are very common causes for Acadia. Any other responses? Yes?
Willful neglect of obligations.
Thank you. Willful neglect of obligations. What's an example of Acadia in the Bible? This is going to be a tough one, by the way, because there was one verse that I brought forward. Who reckons that there's an example of Acadia in the Bible? There's a few. All right. Christina? Yeah. Is that when he found someone's wife?
Right before that.
Before that.
Saying that all his armies went out to war, he was usually in the front line, but he was like that.
Right. Yeah. Good. What was another example? Yes?
I was going to say maybe Jonah when he's going to call
Yeah. It definitely crosses into despair, doesn't it? That one. And you just need to read chapter 4. The last bit where he's got a tree growing over him and then it dies and he goes, I just want to be dead. I read it, it's pretty much, I'm not even doing a creative translation anymore. There's a whole heap of things that we can be looking at there. Very good. And yes?
Maybe the apostles falling asleep
Yeah.
while Christ was praying.
Not being careful about what they should be careful about, yeah. Now, to be fair, this is like 2 o'clock in the morning. So, when we have our all-night vigil on Wednesday night, but nonetheless, should have been praying with him when he needed them most. Very good. Why are we tempted by Acadia? Yes. Yes. So often. And what can it feel like to experience the temptation of Acadia? Again? Good. I'm sure that there's other concrete jungles as well, but that's the one that I know best. If we don't try to restrain ourselves from Acadia, what can follow? Someone from this half of the room. Yes. Despair, yes. That's the next temptation that follows afterwards. And what should we do to fight against Acadia? Good. What's some good prayers? Yes. Any other suggestions for a good prayers? Where's someone who took notes? What's a particularly good prayer for Acadia? Good. That was what I was thinking of. Fantastic. I think it was... seems like you all know without me saying, but just remind me again. Yes? Thank you. 101 and 17. And other ways to fight? I'll just take one more. Yes. Study Bible. Yes, very much so. In a number of different ways, but to study the Bible, including asking for understanding or finding understanding from sources that you trust. Were there any questions that we had to conclude with? Do we have an online question? No? Questions about, yes, thank you.
So you mentioned one of the big red flags is not doing your prayer at all. So when you do get into that temptation, praying feels impossible, what do you actually do to overcome that? So you can stand there, but I know for me, like when that happens, I might read the words, but it's not praying.
So that's what we were missing. So let me just try to rephrase your question. What do you do when that wave of attack happens? Sometimes it feels like you're just reading the words, but how do you force yourself through? Is that a fair summary? Good. So what you do, sometimes it's just reading the words. I've said to a number of people, habits are so important because they will tide you over when you don't feel like it. If you're trying to develop muscle, does it matter if you feel like going to the gym? And not for the muscle growth. You'll either do the exercise or you won't do the exercise, and that you'll grow muscle or not. And sometimes you're at that first level of prayer where you're reading the words. You're trying your best, but that's your best right now. Okay. Are you offering your best to God? Yes. Then do that. One of the advices we heard about at the end of yesterday's talk was when it comes to prayer, the first 15 seconds is hard. Standing up and walking over to your icon corner can feel like it's 4 kilometers away when it's just that. And sometimes it's just, I will pray for a minute and then I'll make a decision to continue. But if you are able to start, then you're so much more likely to be able to continue. Sometimes you're at a point where you're going, I will stand and walk to my icon corner. And that's enough. And when you get there, you go, no, I reckon I can do this. At least I reckon I can do some of it. Let's start with some of it and then make another decision later on. But my number one advice is keep your habits, because losing them, it's sad to lose them. Not for other people, for yourself, because you know what you can be doing. Does that help? Good. Other questions? Yes, thank you. And the microphone is incoming.
Oh, wowee. When you jump into the big sad, and because of your lack of trust in God, how do you work through that fear and develop that trust and build that relationship from the perspective of a newbie?
Mm-hmm. I think you do that in a similar way, because we're humans all the time. You do that in a similar way to how you develop trust in most people. You do it time by time. So if you're looking to look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come, that is a hope that we're expressing in the creed. Why is it that we have that hope? Perhaps because we've been convinced. Perhaps because we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there can be nothing else. That of course there will be a finality to this age and a glorious age to come. We've been convinced of this. Sometimes it's because we go step by step. We trust, we know that He has given us the air with which we breathe and the animals and plants for our nourishment as needed. Then we can trust this little thing. Maybe we can go a little bigger. And it's that incremental progress. Sometimes we'll be reading the experiences of others, or learning from the experiences of others. In the lives of the saints, we see a number of miracles that just happen. And these, sometimes miracles are just, we tend not to talk about them. And overall, it's probably a good thing, because some things are really, really sacred and special, and we store them in like the altar of our heart. But a lot of, I shouldn't use comparative terms, but a number of people have miracles that they've experienced. Sometimes that's the holy fire in Jerusalem. Sometimes that's relics where there's this gorgeous smell that comes from them. These are bones. They're not supposed to smell like terribly much at all. And yet there's this incredible fragrance that comes from them. Sometimes it's an icon that's streaming myrrh. Sometimes it could be a number of things. Sometimes it's a changed life. Like out of nowhere, this person, and to use a gospel example, a person who was demon possessed is able to be now sitting down calmly and talking to Jesus. So each of those three are possible avenues. But we want the big giant leaps. Sometimes let's be happy for increments. Does that help? Awesome. Other questions? Yes?
So mine's a bit more of a very particular scenario. Usually I commute about 120 odd kilometres every day on a motorbike on the Bruce. And as you can imagine, at least twice a day I'm nearly getting taken out by a car that's not looking at what they're doing. And usually this results in, sometimes you just get to the point where, I don't care anymore, so I'm just going to drop a gear and disappear, but obviously that's illegal and not particularly safe. So are there any particular prayers that I could say in that situation to prevent myself from getting to the point where you don't care and then you just do whatever to get away from everyone?
I would run with arrow prayers, and specifically Jesus prayer. Speak to your confessor, but that's probably my go-to. Importantly as well is to be saying that before you have the anger response, because that accelerator is an anger response, which is understandable, because I've driven on the Bruce Highway too. I think a few of us have. Not a great stretch of road. So utilizing that as prayer before you need to is good preparation. And then, like sometimes you need to accelerate out of a problem just as a self-preservation measure. Sometimes you'll need to brake, or you need to take different actions depending on the circumstances. But you don't want to be doing this out of anger. You want to be doing this out of making a good choice. And that's an important distinction. You don't want to be in your head swearing at other drivers. You want to be safe. To be safe, to be focused, to be and to be present where you are. Does that help?
Yeah, it does actually.
Good.
Thank you.
I think anyone who has driven will experience this at some point, and I think that the Jesus prayer is very, very helpful in this regard. Any other questions? Yes. I think I'll just take one more after this, by the way.
So I know that we've talked a lot about like how we can help ourselves with this sin, but I guess my question is like, how can we help others who are struggling with this?
That's a toughie. Somewhere between tough and a tricky one. So the good news is that there are things that you're able to do. We talk about envy sometimes and how that's a massive problem. Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins that St. Gregory the Great put together, but it's not one of the 8 patrimonial passions. It fits in under one of them. I honestly don't know which, and it's been on my to-do list to work out which one it kind of got merged into, or spliced out from, whatever. So with envy, we're told you can't really help someone who doesn't want to be helped. Someone who doesn't want to distance themselves from that. But with Acadia, you can. So first thing, there is hope. there is something that can be done. Won't always be successful. In fact, without the other person wanting to change, it probably won't be successful, but at least it's possible. So there's one thing that I'm going to present that's a good thing to do, and one thing that I'm going to present that's a bad thing to do. The bad thing to do is unlimited sympathy, because it's just not going to work. Acadia is one of those sapping temptations. Being driven to good works to avoid prayer, but you're combating Acadia, well, you're going to be sapping life from the people that you're around at some level. And take that to its fullest measure, and that's not good. Short story. So unlimited sympathy with that kind of dejection is it's very, very finite. Saying I'm sorry to hear that is not what I'm talking about, but hour after hour, that's more what we're referring to. What you're looking for is an action. You're looking for an action, not just praying for them separately, although that's a very good and beneficial thing to do. Not just saying, I will pray for you at some point in time, but actually praying for them, praying with them, maybe praying morning/evening prayers together with them. Doing a good thing together gets them outside of themselves. Often Acadia is bouncing around inside yourself, which isn't a great thing. So instead, prayer changes our focus to the beyond, changes our focus to God, changes our focus to God's righteous, whatever the case may be, changes our focus outside of ourselves, and that is something that automatically combats Acadia. So that's where I'd be going. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily the full evening prayers or something. Maybe it's a lot shorter, but to be praying with, and at least in your own head, you're making that sacrifice for them. Does that help? Awesome. One last question, if there is one. Have we had any questions from our online contingent? Our head of AV has also been our mic runner for this particular segment, so if there are questions, sorry that we haven't seen them, but we're checking it now.
Yes, Marina asked a question, but it sounds very similar to Catherine's. Yeah.
Well, it's very good that we answered it then.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Are we done?
Yes, I think we're done.
I was sitting in the corner there, feeling very comfortable listening to your soothing voice, and I was overcome by Acadia at some point in it. And then you described what we should do to counter that. So I've made my way all the way over to give you this. So thank you for such a good talk. The good thing about the way Father Andrew presents things is that he not only highlights difficulties that we all may experience as Orthodox Christians, but also gives very practical and viable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I pray it was beneficial both to people here and to our contingent online.